Chapter 17, Part 1 of Kangaroo by D.H. Lawrence, published in 1923. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by William Jones, Bonita Springs, Florida. Chapter 17, Kangaroo Is Killed, Part 1 of 2. Dear Lovat, also Mrs. Lovat, I don't think it is very nice of you that you don't even call with a tract or a tuberose when you know I am so smitten. Yours, Kangaroo. P.S. Bullets in my marsupial pouch. Of course, Richard went up at once, and Harriet sent a little box with all the different strange shells from the beach. They are curious and interesting for a sick man. Somers found Kangaroo in bed, very yellow and thin, almost lantern-jawed, with haunted, frightened eyes. The room had many flowers and was perfumed with eau de cologne, but through the perfume came an unpleasant, discernible stench. The nurse had asked Richard please to be very quiet. Kangaroo put out a thin yellow hand. His black hair came wispily, pathetically over his forehead, but he said with a faint, husky briskness, "Hello, come at last," and he took Somers' hand in a damp clasp. "I didn't know whether you could see visitors," said Richard. "I can't. Sit down. Behave yourself." Somers sat down, only anxious to behave himself. "Harriet sent you such a silly present," he said. "Just shells we have picked up from the shore. She thought you might like to play with them on the counterpane. Like that sloppy Coventry Patmore poem. Let me look." The sick man took a little Sorrento box with its inlaid design of sirens and peered in at the shells. "I can smell the sea in them," he said hoarsely, and very slowly he began to look at the shells one by one. There were black ones like buds of coal, and black ones with a white spiral thread, and funny, knobbly black and white ones, and tiny purple ones, and a bright sea orange, semi-transparent clamp shell, and little pink ones with long, sharp points, and glass ones, and lovely pearly ones, and then those that Richard had put in, worn shells like sea ivory, marvelous substance, with all the structure showing. Spirals like fairy staircases, and long, pure, phallic pieces that were centers of big shells from which the whirl was all washed away. Also, curious, flat, oval discs with a lovely whirl traced on them, and an eye in the center. Richard liked these especially. Kangaroo looked at them briefly, one by one, as if they were bits of uninteresting printed paper. "Here, take them away," he said, pushing the box aside, and his face had a faint spot of pink in the cheeks. "They may amuse you sometime when you are alone," said Richard apologetically. "They make me know I have never been born," said Kangaroo huskily. Richard was startled, and he didn't know what to answer. So he sat still, and Kangaroo lay still, staring blankly in front of him. Somers could not detach his mind from the slight yet pervading sickening smell. "My sewers leak," said Kangaroo bitterly, as if divining the other's thought. "But they will get better," said Richard. The sick man did not answer, and Somers just sat still. "Have you forgiven me?" asked Kangaroo, looking at Somers. "There is nothing to forgive," said Richard, his face grave and still. "I knew you hadn't," said Kangaroo. Richard knitted his brows. He looked at the long yellow face. It was so strange and so frightening to him. "You bark at me as if I were Little Red Riding Hood," he said, smiling. Kangaroo turned dark, inscrutable eyes on him. "Help me," he said, almost in a whisper. "Help me." "Yes," said Richard. Kangaroo held out his hand, and Richard took it. but not without a slight sense of repugnance. Then he listened to the faint, far-off noises of the town, and looked at the beautiful flowers in the room. Violets, orchids, tuberoses, delicate yellow and red roses, Iceland poppies, orange like transmitted light, lilies. It was like a tomb, like a mortuary, all the flowers, and that other faint, sickening odor. "I'm not wrong, you know," said Kangaroo. "No one says you are," laughed Richard gently. "I am not wrong. Love is still the greatest." His voice sank in its huskiness to a low resonance. Richard's heart stood still. Kangaroo lay quite motionless, but with some of the changeless pride which had lent him beauty at times when he was himself. The Lamb of God grown into a sheep, yes, the nobility. "You heard Willie Struthers' speech?" said Kangaroo, his voice changing as he looked up at Somers. "Yes." "Well?" "It seemed to me logical," said Richard, not knowing how to answer. "Logical!" Even Kangaroo flickered with surprise. "You and logic!" "You see," said Richard very gently, "the educated world has preached the divinity of work at the lower classes. They broke them in like draft horses, and put them all in the collar, and set them all between the shafts. There they are, all broken in, workers. They are conscious of nothing save that they are workers. They accept the fact that nothing is divine but work, work being service, and service being love. The highest is work. Very well, then, accept the conclusion if you accept the premises. The working classes are the highest. It is for them to inherit the earth. You can't deny that if you assert the sacredness of work." He spoke quietly, gently, but he spoke because he felt it was kinder, even to the sick man, than to avoid discussion altogether. "But I don't believe in the sacredness of work, Lovat," said Kangaroo. "No, but they believe it themselves, and it follows from the sacredness of love." "I want them to be men, 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 not implements at a job." The voice was weak now and took queer, high notes. "Yes, I know, but men inspired by love, and love has only service as its means of expression." "How do you know? You never love," said Kangaroo in a faint, sharp voice. "The joy of love is in being with a beloved, as near as you can get. And I, if I be lifted up, will draw all men unto me." For life's sake, Lovat, not for work. Lift them up that they may live." Richard was silent. He knew it was no good arguing. "Do you think it can't be done?" asked Kangaroo, his voice growing fuller. "I hope I may live to show you. The working men have not realized yet what love is, the perfect love that men may have for one another, passing the love of women. Oh, Lovat, they still have that to experience. Don't harden your heart. Don't stiffen your neck before your old Jewish Kangaroo. You know it is true. Perfect love casteth out fear, Lovat. Teach a man how to love his mate with a pure and fearless love. Oh, Lovat, think what can be done that way." Somers was very pale. His face set. "Say you believe me. Say you believe me. And let us bring it to pass together. If I have you with me, I know we can do it. If you had been with me, this never would have happened to me." His face changed again, as if touched with acid at the thought. Somers sat still, remote. He was distressed, but it made him feel more remote. "What class do you feel that you belong to, as far as you belong to any class?" asked Kangaroo, his eyes on Richard's face. "I don't feel I belong to any class, but as far as I do belong, it is to the working classes. I know that. I can't change." Kangaroo watched him eagerly. "I wish I did," he said eagerly. Then after a pause he added, "They have never known the full beauty of love, the working classes. They have never admitted it. Work, bread, has always stood first, but we can take away that obstacle. Teach them the beauty of love between men, Richard. Teach them the highest, greater love than this hath no man. Teach them how to love their own mate, and you will solve the problem of work forever. Richard, this is true. You know it is true. How beautiful it would be. How beautiful it would be. It would complete the perfect circle." His voice faded down to a whisper, so that Somers seemed to hear it from far off, and it seemed like some far-off voice of annunciation. Yet Richard's face was hard and clear and sea-bitter as one of the worn shells he had brought. "The faithful, fearless love of man for man," whispered Kangaroo, as he lay with his dark eyes on Richard's face and the wisp of hair on his forehead. Beautiful. He was beautiful again, like a transfiguration. "We've got to save the people. We've got to do it. And when shall we begin, friend? When shall we begin, you and I?" He repeated in a sudden full voice. "Only when we dare to lead them, Lovat," he added in a murmur. "The love of man for wife and children, the love of man for man, so that each would lay down his life for the other, then the love of man for beauty, for truth, for the right. Isn't that so? Destroy no love, only open the field for further love." He lay still for some moments after this speech that ended in a whisper almost. Then he looked with a wonderful smile at Somers, without saying a word, only smiling from his eyes, strangely, wonderfully. But Richard was scared. "Isn't that all honest Injun, Lovat?" he whispered playfully. "I believe it is," said Richard, though with unchanging face. His eyes, however, were perplexed and tormented. "Of course you do. Of course you do," said Kangaroo softly. "But you are the most obstinate little devil and child that ever opposed a wise man like me. For example, don't you love me in your heart of hearts, only you daren't admit it? I know you do. I know you do. But admit it, man, admit it, and the world will be a bigger place to you. You are afraid of love." Richard was more and more tormented in himself. "In a way, I love you, Kangaroo," he said. "Our souls are alike somewhere, but it is true I don't want to love you." And he looked in distress at the other man. Kangaroo gave a real little laugh. "Was ever woman so coy and hard to please?" he said in a warm, soft voice. "Why don't you want to love me, you stiff-necked and uncircumcised Philistine? Don't you want to love Harriet, for example?" "No, I don't want to love anybody. Truly. It simply makes me frantic and murderous to have to feel loving any more." "Then why did you come to me this morning?" Well, the question was pertinent. Richard was baffled. "In a way," he said vaguely, "because I love you, but love makes me feel I should die." "It is your willful refusal of it," said Kangaroo a little wearily. "Put your hand on my throat. It aches a little." He took Richard's hand and laid it over his warm, damp, slick throat. There the pulse beat so heavy and sick, and the Adam's apple stood out hard. "You must be still now," said Lovat, gentle like a physician. "Don't let me die," murmured Kangaroo, almost inaudible, looking into Richard's muted face. The white, silent face did not change, only the blue-gray eyes were abstract with thought. He did not answer, and even Kangaroo dared not ask for an answer. At last he let go Richard's hand from his throat. Richard withdrew it and wanted to wipe it on his handkerchief, but he refrained, knowing the sick man would notice. He pressed it very secretly, quietly under his thigh to wipe it on his trousers. "You are tired now," he said softly. "Yes." "I will tell the nurse to come." "Yes." "Goodbye. Be better," said Richard sadly, touching the man's cheek with his fingertips slightly. Kangaroo opened his eyes with a smile that was dark as death. "Come again," he whispered, closing his eyes once more. Richard went blindly to the door. The nurse was there waiting. Poor Richard! He went away almost blinded with stress and grief and bewilderment. Was it true what Kangaroo had said? Was it true? Did he, Richard, love Kangaroo? Did he love Kangaroo and deny it? And was the denial just a piece of fear? Was it just fear that made him hold back from admitting his love for the other man? Fear? Yes, it was fear. But then did he not believe also in the God of fear? There is not only one God. There was not only one God of love. To insist that there is only one God, and that God the source of love, is perhaps as fatal as the complete denial of God and all mystery. He believed in the God of fear, of darkness, of passion, and of silence, the God that made a man realize his own sacred aloneness. If Kangaroo could have realized that too, then Richard felt he would have loved him in a dark, separate, other way of love, but never this all-in-all thing. As for politics, there is so little to choose, and choice meant nothing. Kangaroo and Struthers were both right, both of them. Lords or doctors or Jewish financiers should not have more money than a simple working man just because they were lords and doctors and financiers. If service was the all-in-all, it was absolutely wrong, and Willie Struthers was right. The same with Kangaroo. If love was the all-in-all, then the great range of love was complete, as he put it. A man's love for wife and children, his sheer, confessed love for his friend, his mate, and his love for beauty and truth. Whether love was all in all or not, this was the great, wonderful range of love, and love was not complete short of the whole. But something else was true at the same time. Man's isolation was always a supreme truth and fact not to be forsworn, and the mystery of apartness, and the greater mystery of the dark God beyond a man, the God that gives a man passion, and the dark, unexplained blood tenderness that is deeper than love, but so much more obscure, impersonal, and the brave, silent blood pride knowing its own separateness and the sword strength of his derivation from the dark God. This dark, passionate religiousness, an inward sense of an indwelling magnificence, direct flow from the unknowable God, this filled Richard's heart first, and human love seemed such a fighting for candlelight when the dark is so much better. To meet another dark worshipper, that would be the best of human meetings. But strain himself into a feeling of absolute human love, he just couldn't do it. Man's ultimate love for man? Yes, but only in the separate darkness of man's love for the present, unknowable God. Human love as a God act, very well. Human love as a ritual offering to the God who is out of the light, well and good. But human love as an all-in-all? No, the strain and the unreality of it were too great. He thought of Jack and the strange, unforgettable, up-tilted grin on Jack's face as he spoke of the satisfaction of killing. This was true, too, as true as love and loving. Nay, Jack was a killer in the name of love. That also has come to pass again. It is the collapse of the love ideal, said Richard to himself. I suppose it means chaos and anarchy. Then there will have to be chaos and anarchy in the name of love and equality. The only thing one can stick to is one's own isolate being and the God in whom it is rooted. And the only thing to look to is the God who fulfills one from the dark. And the only thing to wait for is for men to find their aloneness and their God in the darkness. Then one can meet his worshippers in a sacred contact in the dark. Which being so, he proceeded as ever to try to disentangle himself from the white octopus of love. Not that even now he dared quite deny love. Love is perhaps an eternal part of life, but it is only a part. And when it is treated as if it were a whole, it becomes a disease, a vast white strangling octopus. All things are relative and have their sacredness in their own true relation to all other beings, and he felt the light of love dying out in his eyes, in his heart, in his soul, and a great healing darkness taking its place with a sweetness of everlasting aloneness, and a stirring of dark blood tenderness, and a strange soft iron of ruthlessness. He fled away to be by himself as much as he could. His great relief was the shore. Sometimes the dull exploding of the waves was too much for him, like hammer strokes on the head. He tried to flee inland, but the shore was his solace for all that. The huge white rollers of the Pacific breaking in a soft, snow-rushing wall, while the thin spume flew back to the sea like a combed mane, combed back by the strong, cold land wind. The thud, the pulse of the waves, that was his nearest throb of emotion. The other emotions seemed to abandon him, so suddenly and so completely to abandon him. So it was when he got back from Sydney, and, in the night of moonlight, went down to the low cliff to the sand. Immediately the great rhythm and ringing of the breakers obliterated every other feeling in his breast, and his soul was a moonlit hollow with the waves striding home. Nothing else. And in the morning the yellow sea faintly crinkled by the inrushing wind from the land, and long straight lines on lacquered meadow, long straight lines that reared at last in green glass, then broke in snow and slushed softly up the sand. Sometimes the black skulking fin of a shark. The water was very clear, very green, like bright green glass. Another fish with a humpy sort of fins sticking up, and horror in the great green water, a big red mouth wide open. One day the fins of dolphins near, it seemed almost over the sea edge, and then suddenly, oh wonder, they were caught up in the green wall of the rising water, and there for a second they hung in the watery, bright green pane of the wave, big dark dolphins, a little crowd, with their sharp fins and blunt heads, a little sea crowd in the thin, upreared sea. They flashed with a sharp black motion as the great wave curled to break. They flashed in sea, flashed from the foamy horror of the land, and there they were, black little school, away in the lacquered water, panting, Richard imagined, with the excitement of the escape. Then one of the bold bucks came back to try again, and he jumped clean out of the water above a wave, and kicked his heels as he dived in again. The seabirds were always wheeling, big, dark-backed birds like mollyhawks and albatrosses with a great spread of wings, and the white, gleaming gannets, silvery as fish in the air. In they went, suddenly like bombs into the wave, spitting back the water. Then they slipped out again, slipped out of the ocean with a sort of sly exultance. And ships walked on the wall crest of the sea, shedding black smoke. A vast, hard, high sea with tiny clouds like mirage islets away far, far back beyond the edge. So Richard knew it as he sat and worked on the veranda or sat at table in the room and watched through the open door. But it was usually in the afternoons he went down. It was his afternoon occupation to go down to the sea's edge and wander slowly on the firm sand just at the foam edge. Sometimes the great waves were turning like mill wheels, white, all down the shore. Sometimes they were smaller, more confused, as the current shifted. Sometimes his eyes would be on the sand, watching the wrack, the big bladderweed thrown up, the little sponges like short clubs rolling in the wind, and once only those fairy blue windbags like bags of rainbow with long blue strings. He knew all the places where the different shells were found, the white shells and the black and the red, the big rainbow scoops and the innumerable little black snails that lived on the flat rocks in the little pools. Flat rocks ran out near the coral jetty, and between them little creeks of black, round, crunchy coal pebbles, sea coal. Sometimes there would be a couple of lazy, beach-combing men picking the biggest pebbles and putting them into sacks. On the flat rocks were pools of clear water that many a time he stepped into because it was invisible. The colored pebbles shone, the red anemones pursed themselves up, there were hideous, stumpy little fish that darted swift as lightning, gray with dark stripes. An urchin said they were called toads. "You can't eat 'em. Kill yer if you do. You can't eat blackfish. See me catch one of those toads." All this in a high, shrill voice above the waves. Richard admired the elfish self-possession of the urchin, alone on the great shore all day, like a little wild creature himself. But so the boys were, such wonderful little self-possessed creatures. It was as if nobody was responsible for them, so they learned to be responsible for themselves, like young elf creatures as soon as they were hatched. They liked Richard and patronized him in a friendly, half-shy way. But it was they who were the responsible party. The grown-up they treated with a gentle, slightly off-handed indulgence. It always amused friend Richard to see these Australian children bearing the responsibility of their parents. "He's only a poor old dad, you know. Young fellow like me's got to keep an eye on him, see he's all right." That seemed to be the tone of the urchins of 10 and 11. They were charming, much nicer than the older youths or the men. The jetty straddled its huge gray timbers like a great bridge across the sands and the flat rocks. Under the bridge it was rather dark between the great trunk timbers, but here Richard found the best of the flat, oval disc shells with the whorl and the black eye. By the bank hung curtains of yellowish creeper, and a big crimson peak convolvulus flowered in odd tones, and aloe sent up its tall spike and died at its base. A little bare grassy headland came out, and the flat rocks ran out dark to the sea, where the white waves prowled on 3 sides. Richard would drift out this way, right into the sea on a Sunday afternoon. On the flat rocks, all pocketed with limpid pools, the seabirds would sit with their backs to him, oblivious. Only an uneasy blackbird with a long neck, squatting among the gulls, would wriggle his neck as the man approached. The gulls ran a few steps and forgot him. They were mostly real gulls, big and pure as gray pearl, suave and still, with a mate gleam like eggs of the foam in the sun on the rocks. Slowly Richard strayed nearer. There were little browner birds huddled, and further, one big dark-backed bird. There they all remained like opalescent whitish bubbles on the dark, flat, ragged, wet rock in the sun, in the sea sleep. The blackbird rose like a duck, flying with its neck outstretched, more timid than the rest, but it came back. Richard drew nearer and nearer, within 6 yards of the sea things, beyond the everlasting low white wall of foam, rustling to the flat rock. Only the sea. The black creature rose again, showing the white at his side and flying with a stretched-out neck, frightened-looking like a duck. His mate rose too, and then all the gulls flying low in a sort of protest over the foam tips. Richard had it all to himself, the ever-unfurling water, the ragged, flat, square-holed rocks, the fawned sands inland, the soft sandbank, the sere, flat grass where ponies wandered, the low, red-painted bungalows squatting under coral trees, the ridge of tall, wire-thin trees holding their plumes in tufts at the tip, the stalky cabbage palms beyond in the hollow, clustering low, whitish zinc roofs of bungalows at the edge of the dark trees, then the trees in darkness whooping up to the wall of the tors that ran a waving skyline sagging southward, scattered low, frail-looking bungalows with whitish roofs, and scattered dark trees among. A plume of smoke beyond, out of the scarp front of trees. Near the sky, dark old aboriginal rocks. Then again, on the yellowish forefront of the sea, yellow bare grass, the homestead with leafless coral trees, the ponies above the sands, the pale fawn foreshore, the sea, the floor of wet rock. He had it all to himself, and there, with his hands in his pockets, he drifted into indifference. The far-off, far-off, far-off indifference. The world revolved and disappeared like a stone that has fallen into the sea. His old life, the old meaning, fell and rippled, and there was vacancy with the sea and the Australian shore in it. Far off, as if he had landed on another planet, as a man might land after death, leaving behind the body of care, even the body of desire. Shed all that had meant so much to him, shed all the old world and self of care, the beautiful care as well as the weary care, shed like a dead body. The landscape? He cared not a thing about the landscape. Love? He was absolved from love as if by a great pardon. Humanity? There was none. Thought? Fallen like a stone into the sea. The great glamorous past? Worn thin, frail, like a frail translucent film of shell thrown up on the shore. To be alone, mindless and memoryless between the sea under the somber wall front of Australia. To be alone with a long, wide shore and land, heartless, soulless. As alone and as absent and as present as an aboriginal dark on the sands in the sun. The strange falling away of everything. The cabbage palms and the sea wind were sere like old mops. The jetty straddled motionless from the shore. A pony walked on the sand, snuffling the seaweed. End of Chapter 17, Kangaroo Is Killed, Part 1 of 2. Chapter 17, Part 2 of Kangaroo by D.H. Lawrence, published in 1923. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by William Jones, Bonita Springs, Florida. Chapter 17, Kangaroo Is Killed, Part 2 of 2. The past all gone so frail and thin. What have I cared about? What have I cared for? There is nothing to care about. Absolved from it all, the soft blue, humanless sky of Australia, the pale white unwritten atmosphere of Australia, tabula rasa, the world a new leaf, and on the new leaf, nothing. The clarity of the Australian fragile atmosphere, without a mark, without a record. Why have I cared? I don't care. How strange it is here to be soulless and alone. That was the perpetual refrain at the back of his mind, to be soulless and alone by the Southern Ocean in Australia. Why do I wrestle with my soul? I have no soul. Clear as the air about him, this truth possessed him. Why do I talk of the soul? My soul is shed like a sheath. I am soulless and alone, soulless and alone. That which is soulless is perforce alone. The sun was curving to the crest of the dark ridge. As soon as the sun went behind the ridge, shadow fell on the shore, and cold wind came, he would go home. But he wanted the sun not to sink. He wanted the sun to stand still, for fear it might turn back to the soulful world where love is and the burden of bothering. He saw something clutch in a pool. Crouching, he saw a horror, a dark gray, brown-striped octopus thing with two smallish white beaks or eyes living in a cranny of a rock in a pool. It stirred the denser, viscous pool of itself and unfurled a long, dark arm through the water, an arm studded with bright orange-red studs or suckers. Then it curled the arm in again, cuddling close. Perhaps a sort of dark shore octopus, starfish-colored amid its darkness. It was watching him as he crouched. He dropped a snail shell near it. It huddled closer, and one of the beak-like white things disappeared. Or were they eyes? Heaven knows. It eased out again, and from its dense jelly mass another thick dark arm swayed out, studded with the sea orange studs. And he crowed and watched while the white water hissed nearer to drive him away. Creatures of the sea! Creatures of the sea! The sea water was round his boots. He rose with his hands in his pockets to wander away. The sun went behind the cold dark hill, though the waves still glowed white gold, and the sea was dark blue. But the shore had gone into shadow, and a cold wind came at once, like a creature that was lying in wait. The upper air seethed, seemed to hiss with light, but here was a shadow, cold like the arm of the dark octopus, and the moon already in the sky. Home again. But what was home? The fish has the vast ocean for home, and man has timelessness and nowhere. I won't delude myself with a fallacy of home, he said to himself. The four walls are a blanket I wrap around in timelessness and nowhere, to go to sleep. Back to Harriet? To tea? Harriet? Another bird like himself, if only she wouldn't speak, talk, and feel. The weary habit of talking and having feelings. When a man has no soul, he has no feelings to talk about. He wants to be still. And meaning is the most meaningless of illusions, an outworn garment. Harriet and he, it was time they both agreed that nothing has any meaning. Meaning is a dead letter where a man has no soul, and speech is like a volley of dead leaves and dust stifling the air. Human beings should learn to make weird, wordless cries like animals, and cast off the clutter of words. Old dust and dirt of corpses, words and feelings. The decomposed body of the past whirling and choking us, language, love, and meaning. When a man loses his soul, he knows what a small, weary bit of clockwork it was. Who dares to be soulless finds the new dimensions of life. Home to tea. The clicking of the clock. Tick-tack, tick-tack. The clock. Home to tea, just for clockwork's sake. No home, no tea. Insouciant soullessness, eternal indifference. Perhaps it is only the great pause between carings, but it is only in this pause that one finds the meaninglessness of meanings. Like old husks which speak dust, only in this pause that one finds the meaninglessness of meanings and the other dimensions, the reality of timelessness and nowhere. Home to tea. Do you hear the clock tick? And yet there is timelessness and nowhere, and the clock means nothing with its ticking, and nothing is so meaningless as meanings. Yet Richard meandered home to tea. For the sun had set, the sea of evening light was going pale blue, fair as the evening, faintly glazed with yellow. The eastern sky was a glow of rose and smoke blue, a band beyond the sea, while from the dark land ridge under the western sky an electric fierceness still rushed up past a small but vehement evening star. Somewhere among it all the moon was lying. He received another summons to go to Kangaroo. He didn't want to go. He didn't want any more emotional stress of any sort. He was sick of having a soul that suffered or responded. He didn't want to respond any more or to suffer any more. Saunter blindly and obstinately through the days. But he set off. The wattle bloom, the whitish mealy ones, were aflower in the bush, and at the top of huge poles of stems, big blackish crimson buds and flowers of some sort, shot up out of a clump of spear leaves. The bush was in flower. The sky above was a tender virgin blue. The air was pale with clarity. The sun moved strong, yet with a soft and cat-like motion through the heavens. It was spring, but still the bush kept its somberness along all the pellucid ether. The eternal, unlighted bush. What was the good of caring? What was the point of caring? As he looked at the silent morning bush, gray still in the translucency of the day, a voice spoke quite aloud in him. What was the good of caring, of straining or stressing? Not the slightest good. The vast lapse of time here, and white men thrown in like snow into dusky wine to melt away and disappear, but to cool the fever of the dry continent. Afterwards, in the far off afterwards, a different sort of men might rise to a different sort of care. But as for now, like snow in aboriginal wine, one could float and deliciously melt down to nothingness, having no choice. He knew the kangaroo was worse, but he was startled to find him looking a dead man. A long, cadaverous, yellow face, exactly the face of a dead man, but with an animal's dark eyes. He did not move, but he watched Richard come forward from the door. He did not give him his hand. "How are you?" said Richard gently. "Dying," the one word from the discolored lips. Somers was silent, because he knew it was only too true. Kangaroo's dark eyebrows above his motionless dark eyes were exactly like an animal that sulks itself to death. His brow was just sulking to death like an animal. Kangaroo glanced up at Somers with a rapid turn of his eyes. His body was perfectly motionless. "Did you know I was dying?" he asked. "I was afraid." "Afraid? You weren't afraid. You were glad. They're all glad." The voice was weak, hissing in its sound. He seemed to speak to himself. "Nay, don't say that." Kangaroo took no notice of the expostulation. He lay silent. "They don't want me," he said. "But why bother?" "I'm dying! I'm dying! I'm dying!" suddenly shouted Kangaroo with a breaking and bellowing voice that nearly startled Richard out of his skin. The nurse came running in, followed by Jack. "Mr. Cooley, whatever it is," said the nurse. He looked at her with long, slow, dark looks. "Statement of fact," he said in his faint, husky voice. "Don't excite yourself," pleaded the nurse. "You know it hurt you. Don't think about it. Don't. Hadn't you perhaps best be left alone?" "Yes, I'd better go," said Richard, rising. "I want to say good-bye to you," said Kangaroo faintly, looking up at him with strange, beseeching eyes. Richard, very pale at the gills, sat down again in the chair, Jack watching them both, scowling. "Go out, nurse," whispered Kangaroo, touching her hand with his fingers in a loving kind of motion. "I'm all right." "Oh, Mr. Cooley, don't fret. Don't," she pleaded. He watched her with dark, subtle, equivocal eyes, then glanced at the door. She went, obedient, and Jack followed her. "Good-bye, Lovat," said Kangaroo in a whisper, turning his face to Somers and reaching out his hand. Richard took the clammy, feeble hand. He did not speak. His lips were closed firmly, his face pale and proud-looking. He looked back into Kangaroo's eyes, unconscious of what he saw. He was only isolated again in endurance. Grief, torture, shame seethed low down in him, but his breast and shoulders and face were hard, as if turned to rock. He had no choice. "You've killed me! You've killed me, Lovat!" whispered Kangaroo. "Say good-bye to me. Say you love me now you've done it, and I won't hate you for it." The voice was weak and tense. "But I haven't killed you, Kangaroo. I wouldn't be here holding your hand if I had. I'm only so sorry some other villain did such a thing." Richard spoke very gently, like a woman. "Yes, you've killed me," whispered Kangaroo hoarsely. Richard's face went colder, and he tried to disengage his hand, but the dying man clasped him with suddenly strong fingers. "No, no," he said fiercely. "Don't leave me now. You must stay with me. I shan't be long, and I need you to be there." There ensued a long silence. The corpse, for such it seemed, lay immobile and obstinate, yet it did not relax into death, and Richard could not go, for it held him. He sat with his wrist clasped by the clammy thin fingers, and he could not go. Then again the dark, mysterious animal eyes turned up to his face. "Say you love me, Lovat," came the hoarse, penetrating whisper, seeming even more audible than a loud sound. And again Lovat's face tightened with torture. "I don't understand what you mean," he said with his lips. "Say you love me." The pleading, penetrating whisper seemed to sound inside Somers' brain. He opened his mouth to say it. The sound I came out. Then he turned his face aside and remained open-mouthed, blank. Kangaroo's fingers were clutching at his wrist. The corpse face was eagerly upturned to his. Somers was brought to by a sudden convulsive gripping of the fingers around his wrist. He looked down, and when he saw the eager, alert face, yellow, long, Jewish, and somehow ghoulish, he knew he could not say it. He didn't love Kangaroo. "No," he said, "I can't say it." The sharpened face that seemed to be leaping up to him, or leaping up at him, like some snake striking, now seemed to sink back and go indistinct. Only the eyes smoldered low down out of the vague yellow mass of his face. The fingers slackened, and Richard managed to withdraw his wrist. There was an eternity of gray silence, and for a long time Kangaroo's yellow face seemed sunk half visible under a shadow, as a dusky cuttlefish under a pool deep down. Then slowly it came to the surface again, and Richard braced his nerves. "You are a little man, to have come and killed me," came the terrible, pathetic whisper. But Richard was afraid of the face, so he turned aside. He thought in his mind, "I haven't killed him at all." "What shall you do next?" came the whisper, and slowly, like a dying snake rearing itself, the face reared itself from the bed to look at Somers, who sat with his face averted. "I am going away. I am leaving Australia." "When?" "Next month." "Where are you going?" "To San Francisco." "America, America," came the hissing whisper. "They'll kill you in America." And the head sank back on the pillow. There was a long silence. "Going to America, after he's killed me here," came the whispered moan. "No, I haven't killed you. I'm only awfully sorry." You have," shouted Kangaroo in a loud, bellowing voice that frightened Richard nearly out of the window. "Don't lie, you have." The door opened swiftly, and Jack, very stern-faced, entered. He looked at Somers in anger and contempt, then went to the bedside. The nurse hovered in the doorway with an anxious face. "What is it, Roo?" said Jack, in a voice of infinite tenderness, that made Somers shiver inside his skin. "What's wrong, Chief? What's wrong, my dear old man?" Kangaroo turned his face and looked at Somers vindictively. "That man's killed me," he said in a distinct voice. "No, I think you're wrong there, old man," said Jack. "Mr. Somers has never done anything like that. Let me give you a morphia injection to ease you, won't you?" "Leave me alone." Then, in a fretful, vague voice, "I wanted him to love me." "I'm sure he loves you, Roo. Sure he does." "Ask him." Jack looked at Richard and made him a sharp, angry sign with his brows, as if bidding him to comply. "You love our one and only Kangaroo all right, don't you, Mr. Somers?" he said in a manly, take-it-for-granted voice. "I have an immense regard for him," muttered Richard. "Regard? I should think so. We've got more than regard. I love the man. Love him I do. Don't I, Roo?" But Kangaroo had sunk down, and his face had gone small. He was oblivious again. "I want nurse," he whispered. "Yes, all right," said Jack, rising from bending over the sick man. Somers had already gone to the door. The nurse entered, and the two men found themselves in the dark passage. "I shall have to be coming along, Mr. Somers, if you'll wait a minute," said Jack. "I'll wait outside," said Somers, and he went out and down to the street into the sun, where people were moving about. They were like pasteboard figures shifting on a flat light. After a few minutes Jack joined him. "Poor Roo, it's a question of days now," said Jack. Hard lines, you know, when a man's in his prime and just ready to enter into his own. Bitter, hard lines. Yes, that's why I think you were a bit hard on him. I do love him myself, so I can say so without exaggerating the fact. But if I hated the poor man like hell and saw him lying there in that state, why, I'd swear on a red-hot iron that I loved him, I would. A man like that, a big, grand man, as great a hero as ever lived. If a man can't speak 2 words out of pity for a man in his state, why, I think there's something wrong with that man. Sorry to have to say it, but if old Harry himself had lain there like that and asked me to say I loved him, I'd have done it. Heartbreaking it was, but I suppose some folks is stingy about sixpence, and others is stingy about saying 2 words that would have give another poor devil his peace of mind. Richard walked on in angry silence. He hated being condemned in this free and easy, rough and ready fashion. But I suppose chaps from the old country are more careful of what they say. Might give themselves away or something of that. We're different over here. Kick yourself over the cliff like an old can if a mate's in trouble and needs a helping hand or a bit of sympathy. That's us. But I suppose being brought up in the old country, where everybody's frightened that somebody else is going to take advantage of him, makes you more careful. So you're leaving Australia, are you? Mrs. Somers want to go? I think so. Not very emphatically, perhaps. Wouldn't want to if you didn't, so to speak? Oh, Mrs. Somers is all right. She's a fine woman, she is. I suppose I ought to say lady, but I prefer a woman, myself, to a lady any day, and Mrs. Somers is a woman all over, she is that. I'm sorry for my own sake and Vicky's sake that she's going. I'm sorry for Australia's sake. A woman like that ought to stop in a new country like this and breed sons for us. That's what we want. I suppose if she wanted to stop and breed sons, she would, said Richard coldly. They'd have to be your sons. That's the trouble, old man. And how's she going to manage that if you're giving us the go-by? Richard spent the afternoon going round to the customs house and to the American consulate with his passport and visiting the shipping office to get a plan of the boat. He went swiftly from place to place. There were no difficulties. Only both the custom houses and the consulate wanted photographs and Harriet's own signature. She would have to come up personally. He wanted to go now. He wanted to go quickly, but it was no good. He could not get off for another month. So he must preserve his soul in patience. No, said Richard to himself, thinking of Kangaroo. I don't love him. I detest him. He can die. I'm glad he is dying. And I don't like Jack either, not a bit. In fact, I like nobody. I love nobody and I like nobody, and there's the end of it as far as I'm concerned. And if I go around loving anybody else or even liking them, I deserve a kick in the guts like Kangaroo. And yet when he went over to the zoo on the other side of the harbor, and the warm sun shone on the rocks and the mimosa bloom, and he saw the animals, the tenderness came back. A girl he had met, a steamer acquaintance, had given him a packet of little white, extra strong peppermint sweets. The animals liked them. The grizzly bear caught them and ate them with excitement, panting after the hotness of the strong peppermint, and opening his mouth wide, wide for more. And one golden-brown old man kangaroo, with his great earth-cleaving tail and his little hanging hands, hopped up to the fence and lifted his sensitive nose, quivering, and gently nibbled the sweet between Richard's fingers. So gently, so determinedly nibbled the sweet, but never hurting the fingers that held it. And looking up with the big, dark, prominent Australian eyes, so aged in consciousness, with the fathomless, dark, fern-aged gentleness and gloom. The female wouldn't come near to eat. She only sat up and watched, and her little one hung its tiny fawn head and one long ear and one foreleg out of her pouch in the middle of her soft, big gray belly. Such a married couple, 2 kangaroos, and the blood in Richard's veins all gone dark with a sort of sad tenderness. The gentle kangaroos, with their weight in heavy blood on the ground, in their great tail. It wasn't the love he felt for them, but a dark animal tenderness and another sort of consciousness deeper than human. It was a time of full moon. The moon rose about 8. She was so strong, so exciting, that Richard went out at 9 o'clock down to the shore. The night was full of moonlight as a mother of pearl. He imagined it had the warmth in it toward the moon, a moon heat. The light on the waves was like liquid radium swinging and slipping. Like radium, the mystic virtue of vivid decomposition, liquid gushing lucidity. The sea, too, was very full. It was nearly high tide. The waves were rolling very tall, with light like a menace on the nape of their necks as they bent. So brilliant. Then, when they fell, the four-flush rushed in a great soft swing with incredible speed up to the shore, on the darkness soft-lighted with moon, like a rush of white serpents, then slipping back with a hiss that fell into silence for a second, leaving the sand of granulated silver. It was the huge rocking of this flat, hollow four-flush moon, dim in its hollow, that was the night to Richard. This is the night and the moon, he said to himself. Incredibly swift and far, the flat rush flew at him, with foam like the hissing open mouth of snakes. In the nearness a wave broke white and high. Then, ugh! Across the intervening gulf, the great lurch and swish as the snakes rushed forward in a hollow frost hissing at his boots. Then failed to bite, fall back hissing softly, leaving the belly of the sands granulated silver. A huge but cold passion swinging back and forth, great waves of radium swooping with a down curve and rushing up the shore, then calling themselves back again, retreating to the mass, then rushing with venomous radium-burning speed into the body of the land, then recoiling with a low swish, leaving the flushed sand naked. That was the night, rocking with cold, radium-burning passion, swinging and flinging itself with venomous desire. That was Richard, too, a bit of human wispiness in thin overcoat and thick boots. The shore was deserted all the way. Only when he came past the creek on the sands, rough wild ponies looking at him, dark figures in the moonlight lifting their heads from the invisible grass of the sand and waiting for him to come near. When he came and talked to them, they were reassured and put their noses down to the grass to eat a bit more in the moon dusk, glad a man was there. Richard, rocking with the radium urgent passion of the night, the huge desirous swing, the call clamor, the low hiss of retreat, the call, and the answerer. Where was his answerer? There was no living answerer, no dark-bodied, warm-bodied answerer. He knew that when he had spoken a word to the night half-hidden ponies with their fluffy legs, no animate answer this time. The radium-rocking, wave-knocking night, his call and his answer both. This God without feet or knees or face, this sluicing, knocking, urging night, heaving like a woman with unspeakable desire, but no woman, no thighs or breast, no body. The moon, the concave mother of pearl of night, the great radium swinging, and his little self. The call and the answer without intermediary. non-human gods, non-human human being. End of chapter 17, part 2. Kangaroo is Killed.
Chapter 18, Part 1 of Kangaroo by D.H. Lawrence. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 18, Adieu Australia, Part 1. Kangaroo died and had a great funeral, but Richard did not go up. He had fixed his berths on the Manganui and would sail away in 20 days to America, the United States, a country that did not attract him at all, but which seemed to lie next in his line of destiny. Meanwhile, he wandered round in the Australian spring. Already he loved it. He loved the country he had railed at so loudly a few months ago. While he cared, he had to rail at it, but the care once broken inside him, it had a deep mystery for him, and a dusky, far-off call that he knew would go on calling for long ages before it got any adequate response in human beings. From far off, from down long fern-dark avenues, there seemed to be the voice of Australia, calling low. He loved to wander in the bush at evening, when night fell so delicately, yet with such soft mystery. Then the sky behind the trees was all soft rose-pink, and the great gum trees ran up their white limbs into the air like quicksilver, plumed at the tips with dark tufts. Like rivulets, the white boughs ran up from the white trunk, or like great nerves, with nerve-like articulations, branching into the dusk. Then he would stand under a tall fern tree, and look up through the whirl of lace above his head, listening to the birds calling in the evening stillness, the parrots making a chinking noise. Sitting at the edge of the bush, he looked at the settlement and the sea beyond. He had quite forgotten how he used to grumble at the haphazard throwing of bungalows here and there and anywhere, how he used to hate the tin roofs and the untidiness. It recalled to him the young Australian captain. "Oh, how I liked the rain on the tin roofs of the huts at the war. It reminded me of Australia." And now, thought Richard to himself, tin roofs and scattered shanties will always remind me of Australia. They seem to be beautiful, though it's a fact they have nothing to do with beauty. But oh, the deep mystery of joy it was to him to sit at the edge of the bush as twilight fell, and look down on the township. The bungalows were built mostly on the sides of the slopes. They had no foundations, but stood on brickwork props which brought them up to the level. There they stood on the hillsides on their short legs with darkness under their floors, the little bungalows, looking as if they weighed nothing, looking flimsy, made of wood with corrugated zinc roofs. Some of them were painted dark red, roofs and all. Some were painted gray. Some were wooden simply. Many had the white-gray zinc roofs, pale and delicate. At the back was always one big water-butt of corrugated iron, a big round tank painted dark red, the corrugation ribs running round, and a jerky red-painted pipe coming down from the eaves. Sometimes there were two of these tanks, and a thin, not very tidy woman in a big straw hat stooping to the tap at the bottom of the tank. The roof came down low, making a long shade over the wooden verandas. Nearly always a little loggia at the back, from which the house door opened, and this little veranda was the woman's kitchen. There she had a little table with her dirty dishes, which she was going to wash up, and a cat would be trotting around, as if it had not an enemy in the world, while from the veranda a parrot called. The bungalows near the bush edge had odd bits of garden nipped out of the paddocks and carefully railed in, then another little enclosure for the calf. At the back the earth was scratched. There was a rubbish heap of ashes and tins slipping into the brambles, and very white fowls clustering for bedtime. In front of the house, in another bit of garden with wooden palings, the two camellia trees full of flowers, one white and one red, like artificial things, but a bit seared by the wind. And at the gate the branching coral trees, still flowering flame from their dark, strong-thrusting, up-curving buds. So with evening falling, there were green roads laid out in the wild, with but one lost bungalow to justify them, and a lost horse wildly galloping round the corner of this blind road to quiet down and look around. A belated collier galloping stiffly on his pony out of the township, and a woman in a white blouse and black skirt with two little girls behind her, driving a ramshackle little buggy with a quick-legged little pony, homewards through the trees. Lights were beginning to glint out. The township was deciding it was night. The bungalows scattered far and wide on the lower levels. There was a network of wide roads, or beginnings of roads. The heart of the township was one tiny bit of street 100 yards long. Main Street. You knew where it was as you looked down on the reddish earth and grass and bush by the rather big roof of pale zinc and a sandy-colored round gable of the hotel, the biggest building in the place. For the rest, it looked from above like an inch of street with tin roofs on either side, fizzling out at once into a wide grass road with a few bungalows and then the bush. But there was the dark railway and the little station, and then again the big paddocks rising to the sea with a ridge of coral trees and a farm place. Richard could see Cooley with its long red roof right on the sea, behind it the rail fences of the paddocks, and the open grass, and the streets cut out and going nowhere, with an odd bungalow here and there. So it was all round, a far and wide scattering of pale-roofed bungalows at random among grassy cut-out streets all along the levels above the sea, but keeping back from the sea, as if there were no sea, ignoring the great Pacific. There were knolls and pieces of Blue Creek hollow, blue of fresh water and lagoons on the yellow sands. Up the knolls perched more bungalows on very long front legs and no back legs, caves of dark underneath. And on the skyline a ridge of wiry trees with dark plume tufts at the end of the wires, and these little loose crystals of different colored, sharp-angled bungalows cropping out beneath, all in a pale, clear air, clear and yet far off, as if it were visionary. So the land swooped in grassy swoops, past the railway, steep up to the bush, here and there thick-headed palm trees left behind by the flood of time and the flood of civilization both, bungalows with flame trees, bare bungalows like packing cases, an occasional wind fan for raising water, a round well pool, perfectly round, then the bush, and a little colliery, steaming among the trees. And so the great tree-covered swoop upwards of the Tor, to the red fume of clouds, red like the flame flowers of sunset, in the darkness of trees the strange birds clinking and trilling, the tree-ferns with their knobby scaly trunks spreading their marvelous circle of lace overhead against the glow, the gum trees like white, naked nerves running up their limbs, and the inevitable dead gum trees poking stark gray limbs into the air, and the thick aboriginal dusk settling down. Richard wandered through the village, homewards. Horses stood motionless in the middle of the road, like ghosts, listening, or a cow stood as if asleep on the dark footpath. Then she too wandered off. At night time always these creatures roaming the dark and semi-dark roads, eating the wayside grass. The motor cars rushing up the coast road must watch for them, but the night-straying cattle were not troubled. They dragged slowly out of the way. The night in the township was full of the sound of frogs, rattling, screeching, whirring, raving like a whole fairy factory going at full speed in the marshy creek bottom. A great gray bird, a crane, came down on wide soft wings softly in the marshy place. A cream-colored pony with a snake-like head stretched out came cropping up the road, cropping unmoved, though Richard's feet passed within a few yards of his nose. Richard thought of the snaky Praxiteles horses outside the Quiroline in Rome. Very, very nearly those old snaky horses were born again here in Australia, or the same vision come back. People mattered so little. People hardly mattered at all. They were there, they were friendly, but they never entered inside one. It is said that man is the chief environment of man. That for Richard was not true in Australia. Man was there, but unnoticeable. You said a few words to a neighbor or an acquaintance, but it was merely for the sake of making a sort of sound. Just a sound. There was nothing really to be said. The vast continent is really void of speech. Only man makes noises to man, from habit. Richard found he never wanted to talk to anybody, never wanted to be with anybody. He had fallen apart out of the human association. And the rest of the people either were the same or they herded together in a promiscuous fashion. But this speechless, aimless solitariness was in the air. It was natural to the country. The people left you alone. They didn't follow you with their curiosity and their inquisitiveness and their human fellowship. You passed and they forgot you. You came again, and they hardly saw you. You spoke, and they were friendly, but they never asked any questions, and they never encroached. They didn't care. The profound Australian indifference, which still is not really apathy, the disintegration of the social mankind back to its elements, rudimentary individuals with no desire of communication, speeches, just noises, a herding together like dumb cattle, a promiscuity like slovenly animals, yet the basic indifference under everything. And with it all toiling on with civilization, but it felt like a clock that was running down. It had been wound up in Europe, and was running down, running right down, here in Australia. Men were mining, farming, making roads, shouting politics, but all with that basic indifference, which dare not acknowledge how indifferent it is, lest it should drop everything and lapse into a blank. But a basic indifference, with a spurt of excitement over a horse race, and an occasional joy in a row. It seemed strange to Somers that labour should be so insistent in Australia, or that Kangaroo should have been so burning. But then he realized that these men were all the time yoked to some work. They were all the time in the collar, and the work kept them going a good deal more than they kept the work going. Nothing but the absolute drive of the world's work kept them going. Without it they would have lapsed into the old bush-ranging recklessness, lapsed into the profound indifference which was basic in them. But still they were men, they were healthy, they were full of energy, even if they were indifferent to the aim in front. So they embraced one aim or another, out of need to be going somewhere, doing something more than just backing a horse, something more than a mere day's work and a gamble, some smack at the old established institution of life that came from Europe. There it is, laid all over the world, the heavy established European way of life, like their huge ponderous cathedrals and factories and cities, enormous encumbrances of stone and steel and brick, weighing on the surface of the earth. They say Australia is free, and it is, even the flimsy, foundationless bungalows. Richard railed at the scrappy amorphousness, till 2 nights he dreamed he was in Paris, and a 3rd night it was in some other city of Italy or France. Here he was staying in a big palazzo of the house, and he struggled to get out, and found himself in a high old provincial street with old gable houses and dark shadow, and himself in the gulf between, and at the end of the street a huge pale grey bulk of a cathedral, an old Gothic cathedral, huge and massive and grey and beautiful. But suddenly the mass of it made him sick, and the beauty was nauseous to him, so strong a feeling that he woke up. And since that day he had been thankful for the amorphous, scrappy scattering of foundationless shacks and bungalows. Since then he had loved the Australian landscape, with the remote gum trees running their white nerves into the air, the random streets of flimsy bungalows, all loose from one another, and temporary seeming, the bungalows perched precariously on the knolls, like Japanese paper houses, below the ridge of wire and tufted trees. He had now a horror of vast superincumbent buildings. They were a nightmare, even the cathedrals, huge bulks that are called beauty. Beauty seemed to him like some turgid tumour. Never again, he felt, did he want to look at London, the horrible weight of it, or at Rome with all the pressure on the hills, horrible, inert, man-moulded weight, heavy as death. No, the flimsy hills of Australia were like the New World, and the frail inconspicuousness of the landscape that was still so clear and clean of all fogginess or confusion. But the frail, aloof, inconspicuous clarity of the landscape was like a sort of heaven, bungalows, shacks, corrugated iron, and all. No wonder Australians love Australia. It is the land that as yet has made no great mistake, humanly. The horrible human mistakes of Europe, and probably the even worse human mistakes of America. Then why am I going? He asked himself. Wait, he answered himself. You have got to go through the mistakes. You've got to go all round the world, and then halfway round again, till you get back. Go on. The world is round, and it will bring you back. Draw your ring round the world, the ring of your consciousness. Draw it round until it is complete. So he prepared with a quiet heart to depart. The only person that called at Cooley was Jazz. "You're leaving us, then?" he said. "Yes," rather suddenly at the end. Perhaps, but it's just as well I should go soon if I am going." "You think so? Taken against the place, have you?" "No, the contrary. If I stay much longer, I shall stay altogether." "Come quite to like it?" Jas smiled slowly. "Yes, I love it, Jas. I don't love people, but this place, it goes into my marrow. It makes me feel drunk. I love Australia." "That's why you leave it, eh?" "Yes, I'm frightened. What I want to do is go a bit further back into the bush, near some little township, have a horse and a cow of my own, and damn everything." "I can quite understand the damn everything part of it," laughed Jas. "You won't do it, though. I never was so tempted in my life. Talk about Eve tempting man to a fall. Australia tempts me. Retro me." Jas was silent for a few moments. "You'd repent it, though," he said quietly. "I'll probably repent whatever I do," replied Somers. "So what's the odds? I'll probably repent bitterly going to America, going back to the world, when I want Australia. I want Australia as a man wants a woman. I fairly tremble with wanting it. Australia. Yes." Jas looked at Somers with his curious light gray eyes. "Then why not stop?" he said seductively. "Not now, not now. Some cussedness inside me. I don't want to give in, you see. Not yet. I don't want to give in to the place. It's too strong. It would lure me quite away from myself. It would be too easy. It's too tempting. It's too big a stride, Jas." Jas laughed, looking back at Richard's intense eyes. "What a man you are, Mr. Somers," he said. "Come and live in Sydney, and you won't find it such a big jump from anywhere else." "No, I wouldn't want to live in Sydney. I'd want to go back in the bush near one of the little townships. It's like wanting a woman, Jas. I want it." "Then why not do it?" "I won't give in, not yet. It's like giving in to a woman. I won't give in yet. I'll come back later." Jas suddenly looked at Richard and smiled maliciously. "You won't give in, Mr. Somers, will you? You won't give in to the woman? And Australia's like a woman to you. You wouldn't give in to Kangaroo, and he's dead now. You won't give in to labor or socialism. Well, now, what will you do? Will you give in to America, do you think?" "Heaven preserve me if I'm to speak beforehand." "Why, Mr. Somers," laughed Jas, "seems to me you just go round the world looking for things you're not going to give in to. You're as bad as we folk." "Maybe," said Richard, "but I'll give in to the Lord Almighty, which is more than you'll do." "Oh, well, now, we'd give in to him if we saw him," said Jas, smiling with an odd winsomeness he sometimes had. "All right. Well, I prefer not to see, and yet to give in," said Richard. Jas glanced up at him suspiciously from under his brows. "And another thing," said Richard, "I won't give up the flag of our real civilized consciousness. I'll give up the ideals, but not the aware, self-responsible, deep consciousness that we've gained. I won't go back on that, Jas, though Kangaroo did say I was the enemy of civilization." "You don't consider you are, then?" asked Jas, pertinently. "The enemy of civilization? Well, I'm the enemy of this machine civilization and this ideal civilization, but I'm not the enemy of the deep, self-responsible consciousness in man, which is what I mean by civilization. In that sense of civilization, I'd fight forever for the flag, and try to carry it on into deeper, dark places. It's an adventure, Jas, like any other, and when you realize what you're doing, it's perhaps the best adventure." End of Chapter 18. Adieu Australia, Part 1. Chapter 18, Part 2 of Kangaroo by D.H. Lawrence, published in 1923. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 18. Adieu Australia, Part 2. Harriet brought the tea tray onto the veranda. "It's quite nice that somebody has come to see us," she said to Jas. "There seems such a gap, now Kangaroo is gone, and all he stood for." "You feel a gap, do you?" asked Jas. "Awful, as if the earth had opened. As for Lovat, he's absolutely broken-hearted, and such a trial to live with." Jas looked quickly and inquiringly at Somers. "Sort of metaphysical heart," Richard said, smiling wryly. Jas only looked puzzled. "Metaphysical," said Harriet. "You'd think to hear him he was nothing but a teapot brewing metaphysical tea. As a matter of fact, Kangaroo went awfully deep with him, and now he's heartbroken, and that's why he's rushing to America. He's always breaking his heart over something, anything except me. To me, he's another millstone." "Is that so?" said Jazz. "But one feels awful, you know. Kangaroo dying like that. Lovat likes to show off and be so beastly high and mighty about things, but I know how miserable he is." They were silent for some time, and the talk drifted. In the newspapers, Somers read of a big cyclone off the coast of China, which had engulfed thousands of Chinese. The cyclone was now traveling south, lashing its tail over the New Hebrides, and swooping its paws down the thousands of miles of eastern coast of Australia. The monster was expected to have spent itself by the time it reached Sydney, but it hadn't, not quite. Down it came, in a great darkness. The sea began to have a strange yelling sound in its breakers. The black cloud came up like a wall from the sea. Everywhere was dark, and the wind broke in volleys from the sea, and the rain poured as if the cyclone were a great bucket of water pouring itself endlessly down. Richard and Harriet sat in the dark room at Cooley, with a big fire and darkness raging in waters around. It was like the end of the world. The roaring snarl of the sea was of such volume, the volleying roar of the wind so great as to create almost a sense of silence in the room. The house was like a small cave under the water. Rain poured down in waves over the dark room, and with a heaviness of spume. Though the roof came down so far and deep over the verandas, yet the water swept in and gurgled under the doors and in at the windows. Tiles were ripped off the veranda roof with a crash, and water splashed more heavily. For the first day there was nothing to do but to sit by the fire, and occasionally mop up the water at the seaward door. Through the long, low windows you saw only a yellow, livid fume, and over all the boom you heard the snarl of water. They were quite cut off this day, alone, dark, and the devastation of water. The rain had an iciness, too, which seemed to make a shell round the house. The two beings, Harriet and Lovat, kept alone and silent in the shell of a house, as in a submarine. They were black inside as out. Harriet particularly was full of a storm of black chagrin. She had expected so much of Australia. It had been as if all her life she had been waiting to come to Australia, to a new country, to a new unspoiled country. Oh, she hated the old world so much. London, Paris, Berlin, Rome, they all seemed to her so old, so ponderous with ancient authority and ancient dirt. Ponderous, ancient authority especially. Oh, how she hated it. Freed once, she wanted a new freedom, silvery and paradisical in the atmosphere, a land with a new atmosphere, untainted by authority, silvery, untouched freedom. And in the first months she had found this in Australia, in the silent, silvery blue days, and the unbreathed air, the strange remote forms of tree and creature. She had felt herself free, free, free for the first time in her life. In the silvery, pure air of this undominated continent, she could swim like a fish that is just born, alone in a crystal ocean. Woman that she was, she exulted, she delighted. She had loved Cooley, and she just could not understand that Richard was so tense, so resistant. Then gradually, through the silver glisten of the new freedom, came a dull, sinister vibration. Sometimes from the interior came a wind that seemed to her evil. Out of the silver paradisical freedom, untamed evil winds could come, cold, like a stone hatchet murdering you. The freedom, like everything else, had two sides to it. Sometimes a heavy reptile hostility came off the somber land, something gruesome and infinitely repulsive. It frightened her as a reptile would frighten her, as if it wound its cold foils around her. For the past month now, Australia had been giving her these horrors. It was as if the silvery freedom suddenly turned and showed the scaly back of a reptile and the horrible paws. Out of all her bird-like elation at this new-found freedom for her, the female, suddenly, without warning, dark revulsion struck her, it would seem, in her deepest female self, almost in her womb. These revulsions sent her into a frenzy. She had sudden, mad loathings of Australia, and these made her all the more frenzy because of her former great radiant hopes and her silvery realizations. What, must it all be taken back from her, all this glisten of paradise? this glisten of paradise, this silvery freedom like protoplasm of life, was it to be revoked? There was Richard, that hellbird, preaching at her. Don't trust it. You can't have this absolved sort of freedom. It's an illusion. You can't have this freedom absolved from control. It can't be done. There is no stability. There will come a reaction and a devastation, inevitable. You must have deep control from within. You must have a deep, dark weight of authority in your own soul. You must be most carefully, sternly controlled from within. You must be under the hand of the Lord. You can't escape the dark hand of the Lord, not even in free Australia. You'll get the devils lurking on you if you try too much freedom. It can't be done. Too much freedom means you absolve yourself from the hand of the Lord. And once you're really absolved, you fall a prey to devils. Devils! You'll see. All you white females raging for further freedom. Wait till you've got it, and see how the devils will bite you with unclean, reptile sort of mouths. Wait, you who love Australia and its freedom, only let me leave you to the freedom, till it bites you with a sort of sewer mouth, like all these rats. Only let me abandon you to this freedom. Only let me. So he had preached at her, like a dog barking senselessly, and oh, how it had annoyed her. Yet gradually, quite apart from him, it had begun to happen to her, these hateful revulsions, when Australia had turned, as it were, unclean to her, with an unclean sort of malevolence, and her revulsions had possessed her. Then the death of Kangaroo, and now this blackness, this slough of water, this noise of hellish elements. To Richard it was like being caged in with a sick tiger, to be shut up with Harriet in this watery cave of gloom, like a sullen sick tiger. She could hardly get herself to move. The weight of her revulsion was so deep upon her. She loathed Australia with wet, dark revulsion. She was black, sick with chagrin, and she hated that barking white dog of a Richard, with his yapping about control and authority and the hand of the Lord. She had left Europe with her teeth set in hatred of Europe's ancient encumbrance of authority, and of the withered, repulsive weight of the hand of the Lord, that old Jew, upon it. Undying hostility to old Europe, undying hope for the new free lands, especially this far Australia. And now, was the freedom all going to turn into dirty water? All the uncontrolled gentleness and uncontaminated freedom of Australia, was it going to turn and bite her like the ghastly bite of some unclean-mouthed reptile, an iguana, a great newt? Had it already bitten her? She was sick with revulsion. She wanted to get out, away to America, which is not so sloppy and lovey, but hard and greedy and domineering perhaps, but not mushy lovey. These 3 days of dark wetness, slough, and wind finished her. On the second morning there was an abatement, and Richard rushed to the post. The boys, barefoot, bare-legged in the icy water, were running to school under mackintosh capes. Down came the rain and a wind suddenly like a great hose-pipe, and Richard got home a running, streaming pillar of water, home into the dark room and the sulky tiger of Harriet. The storm went on, black, all day, all night, and the next day the same, inside the house as well as out. Harriet sulked the more, like a frenzied, sick tigress. The afternoon of the third day another abatement into light rain, so Richard pulled on thick boots and went out to the shore. His grass was a thin surface stream, and down the low cliffs one cascade stream. The sea was enormous, wave after wave in immediate succession, raving yellow and crashing dull into the land. The yeast spume was piled in hills against the cliffs, among the big rocks, and in swung the raving yellow water, in great dull blows under the land, hoarsely surging out of the dim yellow blank of the sea. Harriet looked at it for a few moments, shuddering and peering down like a sick tigress in a flood. Then she turned tail and rushed indoors. Richard tried to walk under the cliffs, but the whole shore was ruined, changed, a whole mass of new rocks, a chaos of heaped boulders, a gurgle of rushing clayey water, and heaps of collapsed earth. On the fourth day the wind had sunk. The rain was only thin, the dark sky was breaking. Gradually the storm of the sky went down, but not the sea. Its great yellow fore-fringe was a snarl of wave after wave, unceasing, and the shore was a ruin. The beach seemed to have sunk or been swept away. The shore was a catastrophe of rocks and boulders. Richard scrambled along through the dark wetness to a bit of sand, where seaweed was piled like bushes, and he could more or less walk. but soon he came to a new obstacle. The creek, which formerly had sunk at the edge of the beach in a long pool, and left the sloping sand all free and beautiful, had now broken through, leveled the sand, and swept it in a kind of snarling river to the snarling waves across the cut-out sand. The fresh water met the waves with a snarl, and sometimes pushed on into the sea, sometimes was pushed back and heaped up with a rattle of angry protest, waters against waters. The beach never recovered. During the summer's stay the river never subsided into the sand. The sandy foreshore never came back. It was a rocky, boulder-heaped ruin with that stream for an impasse. Harriet would not go down to the sea any more. The waves still raved very high. They would not go back, and they lashed with a venomness to the cliffs, to cut a man off. Richard would wander cold and alone on this inhospitable shore, looking for shells out of the storm, and all the time the waves would lash up, and he would scramble out. It seemed to him female and vindictive. Beastly water, rolling up so high. Beastly water, rolling up so high, breaking all the shells just where they lie. He crooned to himself, crooning a kind of war croon, malevolent against the malevolence of this ocean. Yet it was August, and spring was come. It was Wattle Day in Sydney, the city full of yellow bloom of mimosa. Richard and Harriet went up to the United States Consul, to the shipping office. Everything was easy. But he could not bear to be in Sydney any more. He could hear Kangaroo all the time. It was August and spring, and a hot, hot sun in a blue sky. Only the sea was not or could not return to its old beauties. Richard preferred to go inland. The wattle trees and the camellia trees were full in bloom in the bungalow gardens. Birds flew quickly about in the sun. The morning was quick with spring, the afternoon already hot and drowsy with summer. Harriet, in her soul, had now left Australia for America, so she could look at this land with new, relieved eyes again. She never more passionately identified herself with it as at first. Richard hired a little two-wheeled trap, called in Australia a sulky, with a little pony, to drive into the bush. Sometimes they had gone in a motor car, but they both much preferred the little comfortable sulky. There sat Harriet, full and beaming, and the thin Richard beside her, like any Australian couple in a shabby sulky behind a shabby pony, trotting lazily under the gum trees of the high road and up the steep, steep jungle-dense climb of the mountain to the pass. Nothing is lovelier than to drive into the Australian bush in spring, on a clear day, and most days are clear and hot. Up the steep climb the tree ferns and the cabbage palms stood dark and unlighted as ever among the great gums. But once at the top, away from the high road and the sea face, trotting along the yellow-brown sandy trail through the sunny, thinly scattered trees of the untouched bush, it was heaven. They splashed through a clear, clear stream and walked up a bank into the nowhere, the pony peacefully marching. The bush was in bloom. The wattles were out. Wattle, or mimosa, is the national flower of Australia. There are said to be 32 species. Richard found only 7 as they wandered along. The little pale sulphur wattle, with a reddish stem, sends its lovely sprays so aerial out of the sand of the trail, only a foot or 2 high, but such a delicate, spring-like thing. The thorny wattle, with its fuzzy pale balls, tangles on the banks. Then beautiful heath plants with small bells like white heather stand in tall straight tufts, and above them the gold sprays of the intensely gold bush mimosa, with here and there on long thin stalks, like hairs almost, beautiful blue flowers with gold grains, 3-petaled like reed flowers, and blue with a touch of Australian darkness. Then comes a hollow, desolate, bare patch with empty greyness, and a few dead, charred gum trees, where there had been a bushfire, and at the side of this bare place great flowers, 10 feet high, like sticky dark lilies in bulb bud. At the top of the shaft, dark blood red. Then over another stream, and scattered bush once more, and the last queer gold-red bushes of the bottle-brush tree, like soft, bristly, golden bottle-brushes standing stiffly up, and the queer black boys on one leg with a tuft of dark green spears, sending up the high stick of a seed stalk much taller than a man, and here and there the gold bushes of wattle with their narrow dark leaves. Richard turned, and they plunged into the wild grass in strange bushes, following the stream. By the stream the mimosa was all gold, great gold bushes, full of spring fire rising above your head, and the scent of the Australian spring, and the most ethereal of all golden bloom, the plummy many-balled wattle, and the utter loneliness, the manlessness, the untouched blue sky overhead, the gaunt lightless gum trees rearing a little way off, and sound of strange birds, vivid ones of strange brilliant birds that flit round, save for that and for some weird frog-like sound, indescribable, the age-unbroken silence of the Australian bush. But it is wonderful, out of the sombreness of gum trees that seem the same, hoary forever, and that are said to begin to wither from the center the moment they are mature, out of the hollow bush of gum trees in silent heaths, all at once in spring, the most delicate feathery yellow of plumes and plumes and plumes and trees and bushes of wattle, as if angels had flown right down out of the softest gold regions of heaven to settle here, in the Australian bush, and the perfume in all the air that might be heaven, and the unutterable stillness, save for strange bright birds and flocks of parrots, and the motionlessness, save for a stream and butterflies and some small brown bees, yet a stillness and a manlessness and an elation, the bush flowering at the gates of heaven. Somers and Harriet left the pony and clambered along the stream, past trees of the gray feathery-leaved wattle, most sumptuous of all in soft gold in the sky, and bushes of the gray hard queer-leaved wattle, on to the thick green of strange trees narrowing into the water. The water slithered, rushing over steep rocks. The two scrambled down, and along after the water, to an abrupt edge. There the water fell in a great roar down a solid rock, and broke and rushed into a round dark pool, dark, still, fathomless, low down in a gruesome dark cup in the bush, with rocks coming up to the trees. In this tarn the stream disappeared. There was no outlet. Rock and bush shut it in. The river just dived into the ground. It was a dark, frightening place, famous for snakes. Richard hoped the snakes were still sleeping, but there was a horror of them in the air, rising from the tangled undergrowth, from under the fallen trees, the gum trees that crashed down into the great ferns, eaten out by white ants. In this place already the Christmas bells were blooming, like some great heath with hanging bright red bells tipped with white, other more single bellflowers, a little bit like foxgloves, but stiff and sharp, all the flowers stiff, sharp, like crystals of color come opaque out of the somber, stiff, bristly bush plants. Harriet had armfuls of bloom, gold plumage of many branches of different wattles, and the white heather, the scarlet bells, with the deep blue reed blobs. The sulky with all the bloom looked like a corner of paradise, and as they trotted home through the bush, evening was coming, the gold sun slanting, but Richard kept jumping out from among the flowers to plunge into the brake for a new flower, and the little pony looked round watching him impatiently and displeased. But it was a gentle, tolerant, Australian little beast, with untold patience, only Harriet was frightened of the coming dusk. So at length they were slipping down the steep slopes again, between the dense creeper-tangled jungle and tree ferns, dark, chilly. They passed a family moving from nowhere to nowhere, 2 colts trotting beside the wagon, and they came out at last at the bottom, to the lost, flickering little township at nightfall. At home, with all the houses full of blossom, but fluffy gold wattle bloom, they sat at tea in the pleasant room, the bright fire burning, eating boiled eggs and toast, and they looked at one another, and Richard uttered the unspoken thought, "Do you wish you were staying?" I stammered Harriet. "If I had 3 lives, I'd wish to stay. It's the loveliest thing I've ever known." "I know," he answered, laughing, "if one could live 100 years, but since one only has a short time." They were both silent. The flowers there in the room were like angel presences, something out of heaven. The bush, the wonderful Australia. Yet the day came to go, to give up the keys and leave the lonely bare Cooley to the next comers. Even the sea had gone flowery again at last, and everybody was so simple, so kindly at the departure. Harriet felt she would leave behind her forever something of herself in that Cooley home, and he knew that one of his souls would stand forever out on those rocks beyond the jetty. Towards Bully, advanced into the sea, with the dark magic of the Tor standing just inland. The journey to Sydney was so spring-warm and beautiful in the fresh morning. The bush now and then glowed gold, and there were almond and apricot trees near the little wooden bungalows, and by the railway unknown flowers, magenta and yellow and white, among the rocks, the frail, wonderful Australian spring coming out of all the gummy hardness and sombreness of the bush. Sydney in the warm harbour. They crossed over once more in the blue afternoon. Kangaroo dead, Sydney lying on its many-lobed blue harbour in the Australian spring. The many people, all seeming dissolved in the blue air. Revolution, nothingness. Nothing could ever matter. On the last morning, Victoria and Jazz's wife came to see the Somers off. The ship sailed at 10. The sky was all sun. The boat reared her green paint and red funnel to the sun. Down below in the dark shadow of the wharf stood all those who were to be left behind, saying goodbye, standing down in the shadow under the ship and the wharf, their faces turned up to the passengers who hung over the rail. A whole crowd of people down on the wharf, with white uplifted faces, and one little group of quiet Chinese. Everybody had brought streamers, rolls of colored paper ribbon, and now the passengers, leaning over the rail of the lower and middle decks, tossed the unwinding rolls to their friends below. So this was the last tie, this ribbon of colored paper. Somers had a yellow and a red one. Victoria held the end of the red streamer, Jazz's wife the end of the yellow. Harriet had blue and green streamers, and from the side of the ship a whole glittering tangle of these colors connecting the departing with the remaining, a crisscross of brilliant color that seemed to glitter like a rainbow in the beams of the sun, as it rose higher, shining in between the ship and the wharf shed, touching the faces of the many people below. The gangway was hoisted. The steamer gave long hoots. Only the criss-crossing web of brilliant streamers went from the hands of the departing to the hands of those who would be left behind. There was a sort of silence. The calling seemed to die out, and already, before the cables were cast loose, the gulf seemed to come. Richard held fast to the two streamers, and looked down at the faces of the two women who held the other ends of his paper threads. He felt a deep pang in his heart, leaving Australia, that strange country that a man might love so hopelessly. He felt another heartstring going to break like the streamers, leaving Australia, leaving his own British connection. The darkness that comes over the heart at moments of departure darkens the eyes too, and the last scene is remote, detached inside a darkness. So now, when the cables were cast loose, and the ship slowly left the side of the wharf and drew gradually toward the easier waters of the harbor, there was a little gulf of water between the ship and the wharf. The streamers lengthened out. They glittered and twinkled across the space, almost like music, so many-colored. And then the engines were going, and the crowd on the wooden quay began to follow slowly, holding the frail streamers carefully, like the ends of a cloud, following slowly down the quay as the ship melted from shadow to the sun beyond. One by one the streamers broke and fluttered loose and fell bright and dead on the water. The slow crowd, slow as a funeral, was at the end, the far end of the quay, holding the last streamers, but the ship inexorably drifted out, and every colored strip was broken. The crowd stood alone at the end of the wharf. The side of the vessel was fluttering with bright, broken ends. So it was time to take out handkerchiefs and wave across space. Few people wept. Somers waved and waved his orange silk kerchief in the blue air. Farewell, farewell, farewell Victoria and Jazz's wife. Farewell Australia. Farewell Britain and the great empire. Farewell, farewell, the last streamers blowing away like broken attachments, broken heartstrings. The crowd on the wharf gone tiny in the sun, and melting away as the ship turned. Richard watched the observatory go by, then the circular quay with all its ferry wharves, and a Nippon steamer lying at her berth, and a well-known big buff and black P&O boat at the P&O wharf, looking so like India. Then that was gone too, and the governor's palace, and the castellated conservatorium of music on its hill, where Richard had first seen Jack, the palace gardens, and the blue inlet where the Australian fleet lay, comfortably rusting. Then they drifted across harbour, nearer to the wild-seeming slope, like bush, where the zoo is, and then they began to wait, to hang round. There ahead was the open gate of the harbour, the low heads with the south lighthouse, and the Pacific beyond breaking white. On the left was Manly, where Harriet had lost her yellow scarf, and then the tram going to Narrabeen, where they had first seen Jazz. Behind was the great lobed harbour, so blue, and Sydney rather inconspicuous on the south hills, with its one or two skyscrapers, and already the blue water all round, and a thing of the past. It was midday before they got out of the heads, out of the harbour into the open sea. The sun was hot, the wind cold. There was not very many passengers in the first class, and nobody looked possible to the Somers pair. Richard sat in the sun watching the dark coast of Australia, so sombre, receding. Harriet watched the two seamen casting rubbish overboard. Such a funny assortment of rubbish. The iron sank in the deep dark water. The wood and straw and cardboard drearily floated. The low Sydney heads were not far off. Lovat watched till he could see the dark of the mountain, far away, behind Cooley. He was almost sure of the shape. He thought of the empty house, the sunny grass in front, the sunny foreshore with its new rocks, the township behind, the dark tor, the bush, the Australian spring. The sea seemed dark and cold and inhospitable. It was only 4 days to New Zealand, over a cold, dark, inhospitable sea. End of Chapter 18, Adieu Australia, Part 2. End of Kangaroo by D.H. Lawrence, published in 1923.